Howdy folks, I'm Ben Starr, the ultimate food geek. Welcome back to my kitchen. Today, I am going to perform a miracle. Or at least it's gonna look like a miracle to those of you who have spent hours and hours watching Facebook sourdough videos and think that baking a loaf of sourdough bread is about as complicated as, I don't know, figuring out your Facebook privacy settings. Nobody can figure that out, right? Folks, you have been lied to. YouTube channels are teaching high hydration sourdough methods as if they are the only way to make sourdough bread. Why exactly is the internet absolutely overrun with these really complicated sourdough recipes if it doesn't have to be that hard? Well, the short answer is holes. For some odd reason right now, people love to cut into a loaf of bread and see big old giant holes. For some reason, they prefer the taste of a hole to the taste of bread. What does a hole taste like? Well, hopefully it tastes like nothing. But if we're trying to smear delicious jam or butter or olive oil on our bread, what happens if there's big giant holes? You can't smear anything on a hole. And I don't know about you, but I am way too busy to be babysitting my dough during that bulk fermentation with all the stretching and flapping and folding and strength building techniques that honestly you don't need if you lower the hydration of your dough and let it make itself. You don't have to feed your starter before you bake with it. You don't have to knead your bread. You don't have to slap it or fold it or babysit it every 30 minutes during the first rise for it to turn out. You don't even have to preheat your oven, folks. You can put your loaf of rising bread directly in the cold oven and turn it on, and it will bake you a perfect loaf of sourdough bread. For over 4 years now, tens of thousands of people all over the world have been using my simple sourdough method to bake gorgeous artisan sourdough at home with less than about 10 minutes of effort spread across 24 hours. So today, I'm going to teach you how to do that, using the feedback that I've received from over 4 million views and tens of thousands of comments and questions from viewers. Now, for those of you with only a TikTok attention span, folks, this recipe does only take about 10 minutes of effort once you have mastered it, but I cannot teach you how to do it in 10 minutes. Nothing in life worth learning can take only 10 minutes to learn. So sit down, buckle up, plug in your attention spans and watch this entire video, because this is a masterclass on the methods and science of producing easy, low hydration sourdough. And once you have mastered this process, you will be able to churn this loaf out at home with practically zero effort. Now, for the first part of this video, I'm just going to do a quick demonstration to show you how truly easy it is to do this and prove that it works. All right, our first ingredient is sourdough starter, 4 ounces, cold, sleepy, unfed, straight from the fridge. I haven't fed the starter in like 3 weeks. 12 ounces of water. Gonna get that stirred together. 1 pound and 4 ounces of flour. I'm using an organic, unbleached, all-purpose flour, but bread flour also works. And 7/10 of an ounce of salt, any type. We will talk more about the salt content in the second part of this video. This is a slightly higher salt content than most average bread recipes, but the higher salt content is the reason why this recipe works and is so flexible. Now we're gonna get all of that stirred together. And when it gets a little bit too stiff to stir with a spoon, we're gonna switch to our hand. This is technically a no-knead recipe, so you're not gonna be kneading this for like 10 or 15 minutes the way you would a traditional dough, but it's easier to bring it together with your hands. Yes, you can use a stand mixer if you have one, but it only takes 15 or 20 seconds to get the rest of this dough brought together, and it takes longer than that just to clean the stand mixer, so I like to do it with my hands. All right, now I'm gonna oil the bowl, cover it, and ignore it on the countertop until tomorrow. All right, it has been about 18 hours, and as you can see, my dough has beautifully, well, really tripled. This recipe is super flexible. As long as I wait for it to double, which happened at around the 12-hour mark, I can proceed. So I could have shaped this 6 hours ago, or I could wait another 3 or 4 hours to shape it, depending on my schedule. How nice is that? I'm going to very lightly flour the surface, not too much. Remove my dough. And it's time to shape. Flour the hands. And I'll talk a little bit more about shaping, of course, in the second part of this video. I'm just going to whip this into a nice, tight boule. And don't worry, I am going to show you how to make this in a loaf pan in the second part of the video. So now I'm going to take my baking vessel, which in this case is a cast iron Dutch oven, oil it just a bit, set that boule into the Dutch oven, and now I'm gonna ignore it for 90 more minutes on the countertop. 90 minutes later, our dough is ready for scoring and baking. The simplest way to score is just with scissors. I'll teach you alternate methods later in the video, but for now, we are just going to snip some lines in our bread. And now it gets covered and placed in a cold oven. Now, this might be the hardest part to understand of the whole process. We have just put the dough into a cold oven. Now I'm going to turn the oven on to 425 degrees Fahrenheit and start a 45-minute timer at this moment. We're not waiting for the oven to preheat to start the timer. We start the timer as soon as the bread goes into the cold oven and we turn it on. 45 minutes. And after 45 minutes, we pull off the lid. And the bread bakes for 15 more minutes. And after 15 minutes, it's done. Woohoo! And we dump it out onto a cooling rack, and we're gonna wait about 30 minutes for it to cool before we slice into it. But look at this, folks. I will be dead shocked if I invested more than 10 minutes of my time in this loaf over the last 24 hours. I started it together, forgot about it, shaped it into a loaf, forgot about it, and then stuck it into a cold oven and turned it on. And while you can certainly produce a more spectacular loaf with considerably more effort, why the heck would you want to when you can get a loaf this perfect with practically no effort? I'll be back in 30 minutes and we'll give it a taste. All right, this bread has cooled. It smells amazing. Let's slice into it and see what it looks like. Really even, open, lovely crumb here, folks. This is the perfect bread for toasting, for sandwiches, for making French toast, or just for dipping in olive oil and putting right into your mouth. And speaking of that, let's give it a taste. We've got a really beautiful old world chew, some nice crackle to that crust. The flavor is very complex and only a slight hint of the sourness that a lot of people associate with sourdough bread. That's because we're using refrigerated starter, so the acidity levels of this bread are not very high. It is astounding that the only ingredients in here are flour, water, and salt. We have a profoundly complex depth of flavor in this slow fermented bread. Okay, it is time to begin the masterclass on how you can replicate this bread at home with an equivalent amount of laziness. And I promise you can do it. Even if you have never baked bread ever in your entire life, you can do this. But folks, my videos have had more than 4 million views and tens of thousands of comments, and I have learned pretty much every single pitfall that might befall you on this process. Bread baking is not as easy as following 7 steps in a recipe. That's not how it works, folks. Your sourdough starter is completely different from my sourdough starter. Your kitchen's environment is different from mine. Your oven bakes at a different temperature and rate than mine does. So there is no way I can tell you, do this and this and this and this and it'll work for you. It's gonna work great for 80% of you. And for the remaining 20% of you, you're gonna need a little help troubleshooting. And this video encompasses pretty much any possible cause for the failure of this recipe. All right, step by step, here we go. Folks, please stick with me through the end of this video and don't skip ahead. Even if I start talking about something that you know about and you jump ahead, you are gonna miss something super important. You're gonna come back and ask me a question in the comments, and I'm just gonna tag the timestamp in the video where I already answered that question. It's gonna be super embarrassing and everybody's gonna laugh at you, all right? Please invest the time to learn this. I am gonna cram a ton of information into every second of the rest of this video. First things first, the scale. Folks, I'm sorry to be the harbinger of doom, but you cannot achieve consistent results with baking unless you have a scale. There is a reason why every professional baker on planet Earth uses a scale instead of a measuring cup, and that's because even these are not precise. If you measure a cup of flour, I measure a cup of flour, and your neighbor measures a cup of flour, we are all going to have different amounts of flour. A scale is the only way to ensure consistency. Even a cheap scale will do, but if you want my scale, this is a restaurant quality scale that doesn't take weird batteries, or you can plug it into the wall so you never have to replace the batteries. I'll link to this model in the video description below. Just click where it says more. Now today, I'm speaking in ounces because the majority of my audience is from the United States and we are taught ounces before we are taught metric, if ever. But the metric equivalents are right there on the screen, and you can also get this full recipe written out in the video description below. Click where it says more, or you can click this link to go to the recipe on my website, ultimatefoodgeek.com, for an easy printable recipe. Our first ingredient is sourdough starter, cold, unfed, straight from the fridge. Now, the single biggest stumbling block that people have with this recipe is their starter, and that is because most of you are feeding your starter regularly. So your starter is very robust, you have short fermentation times, and this recipe is not designed for that. This recipe is designed for you to pull your starter out of the fridge, even if it hasn't been fed in a week or a month or 6 months, and use it unfed in this recipe. Now, throughout the rest of the video, I'm going to talk about how you can adapt this recipe to your starter if you regularly feed your starter, but you're not going to get as much flavor in your bread if you were using regularly fed starter. Now, the most important thing about your starter is that it must be at 100% hydration. And that means that when you feed your starter, you are feeding it equal weights of flour and water, not equal volumetric measures. A cup of water is 8 ounces and a cup of flour is 5 ounces. So if you are feeding your starter this way, your starter is not at 100% hydration. And I find that most people that have trouble with this recipe are overhydrated. The extra water is coming from their starter, and when this dough is overhydrated, it does not rise properly. Luckily, you can watch my troubleshooting simple sourdough video linked right up here if you discover that your starter is not at 100% hydration. It's very, very easy to fix. Now, in the first part of the video, I used a starter that hadn't been fed in 3 weeks, but this starter, you guys, has been in my fridge without a feeding since January 11th. That was 5 months ago. I promise you, even if your starter's been in your freezer or in the back of your fridge for months without a feeding, it is still just fine and it will bake you a beautiful and delicious loaf of bread. But if it's been a long time since you fed your starter, you may discover that there is like a weird layer of sort of gray, thick, odd-smelling liquid on top. Some of the old-timers call that hooch. Do not ever pour off your hooch. You've just gotten rid of a bunch of the liquid in your starter and drastically lowered its hydration. Hooch is fine. It's not dangerous. It's mostly water, ethyl alcohol, and fermentation byproducts. It has a lot of flavor in it, and you want that flavor in your bread. So, if you've got a layer of hooch on top of your starter when you pull it out of the fridge, the first thing to do is stir that hooch back into the starter so that you've got a homogeneous starter. Now, you're going to notice that this starter is very liquidy, much more liquidy than the starter I used in the first part of this video. That does not mean that this starter is overhydrated or greater than 100% hydration. As starter ages, it becomes more acidic, and acidity breaks down the bonds of gluten that are formed when flour gets hydrated. So that flour can't hold on to the moisture as much. The moisture comes out and you get a thinner structure. That's perfectly fine. It's okay if your starter looks thin and soupy as long as you are always feeding it equal weights of flour and water. The less amount of time it's been since your last feeding, the thicker your starter will be, but do not worry about your starter's texture if you are feeding it equal weights of flour and water each time. All right, we are starting out with 4 ounces of 100% hydration starter. A lot of folks ask me, how soon after feeding my starter can I mix up a loaf? Well, if you feed your starter regularly, which you shouldn't, you can pull off 4 ounces to bake a loaf immediately after feeding your starter because it is robust and ready to go. But keep watch on your rise times. If you double in less than 8 hours, you're going to risk overproofing if you rise your dough more than 45 minutes on the second rise. If you're like me and you only feed your starter when you get low and you need to make more, I like to give my starter a big feeding. Typically my feedings are 1 pound of flour and 1 pound of water, and I let it sit on the countertop for at least 4 hours until it starts to get bubbly. At that point, it's fine to pull off 4 ounces and mix up a loaf of simple sourdough. Next up is 12 ounces of water, and folks ask me, is that 12 ounces or 12 fluid ounces? They're the same thing, folks. Now, I'm using filtered water here, and the primary reason for that is because my tap water just tastes bad, and I don't want to add an ingredient that tastes bad into my recipe, right? It's actually a myth that using city tap water will destroy your sourdough starter or ruin your bread. It won't. But municipal water sources do contain added bromine, chlorine, or chloramines as purifying agents. And it is true that these have a hindering activity on the bacteria and yeast in our recipe. So to keep your yeast and bacteria happy, use filtered water if you have access to it. Bottled water from the supermarket or convenience store, or filtered water from your fridge, or just a regular old Brita filter will be fine. 12 ounces of water. All right, now, I like to stir those together, especially if my starter is pretty stiff, to distribute the starter into the water. That just gets you a head start on mixing for the next step. For those of you that like to add things to your sourdough, like fresh herbs or jalapenos and sharp cheddar cheese, this is the time that you will add virtually all inclusions for this recipe. Now, I have a very extensive video that I'll link to right up here called Inclusions for Simple Sourdough. You definitely want to check out that video if you like baking fun bread with all sorts of stuff inside of it. Now, our flour. I am just using all-purpose flour, and that's because I don't have a ton of storage space in my kitchen to keep a bunch of different specialty flours. So I pretty much only keep the flour that I use for baking everything, whether it's cookies, pie crust, or fresh bread. This is an organic, heirloom, all-purpose flour that I get in bulk at Costco for about the same price as I would get a regular bag of flour at the supermarket. Now, you can use bread flour, which is flour that contains a higher protein content. This means the flour has a higher gluten potential, and it can result in a better rise and a slightly chewier texture to your bread. Bread flour is fine, there's nothing wrong with it. It's just, I really prefer one flour stream for my entire kitchen, and all-purpose flour works completely fine for this recipe. We are using 20 ounces, or 1 pound and 4 ounces of flour. Now, I get a lot of questions about whole wheat flour. No, you cannot make this recipe with 100% whole wheat flour. For 100% whole wheat flour, you must use those complex high hydration techniques that involve a lot of strength building during the fermentation process. But you can substitute up to 8 ounces of whole grain flour in this recipe, either whole wheat or rye flour, and the recipe will succeed as long as you increase your water content by 1 ounce. So for you whole grain bakers, please check the recipe itself for more information about modifying this recipe to incorporate some whole grains. Ditto for you folks that are using Spelt or Einkorn, some of the heirloom ancient wheat varieties. And now our final ingredient, salt. I use Morton's kosher salt for pretty much everything, but folks, it does not matter what type of salt you use. Pink Himalayan, Celtic salt, sea salt, fine grain, coarse grain, it does not matter as long as you are weighing your salt. Now, this recipe calls for 7/10 of an ounce of salt. 7/10 of an ounce is just over 3% of the baker's percentage for this recipe. And it's true, most sourdough recipes call for a ratio of 1.8 to 2.2% of the baker's percentage of salt. So at 3%, this recipe is higher in salt than most sourdough recipes. There is a reason for this. Within our dough, salt acts as a sort of love potion for two proteins that naturally exist in our flour called gliadin and glutenin. These are the subcomponents that come together to produce gluten, which is the protein structure that makes flour work. Now, for you gluten-free folks, I hate to be the harbinger of doom, but you will never get an edible loaf of sourdough gluten-free bread because gluten is the thing that makes bread work. So while it's very easy to create a gluten-free sourdough starter, it is impossible to turn that starter into an edible loaf of bread. You get something that has the texture of like a kitchen sponge that's been sitting in an old shack for about 200 years. So if you try asking me for a gluten-free version of this recipe, it's never gonna happen. I'm really, really sorry. Because gluten is the thing that is responsible for the texture and the rise of bread. And when those subproteins, glutenin and gliadin, link up, they provide the structure that holds in the gas bubbles that are created by the yeast and the bacteria and cause the bread to rise. But glutenin and gliadin are a little bit shy, folks. They look across that dough matrix at the other one and they're like, oh, you're kind of cute. I might like to hold hands with you. But in most recipes, it actually requires the kneading effort of the baker to force those two proteins to come together at the school dance because they're so shy. We are not going to knead our dough for more than 15 or 20 seconds. So the kneading process does not form the gluten structure. It turns out that after we hydrate our dough or add water to it, glutenin and gliadin, if given enough time staring at each other across the dance floor, will eventually make their way together. But because we're not kneading the dough, we're not forcing them to hold hands. That is where the salt comes in, because the salt is like that love potion. It makes them hold hands and do all the other things that make them completely inseparable. So by raising the salt content of this recipe just a bit, we get a stronger gluten structure, which results in a better rise in a dough that we are not kneading. On some of my older videos, you will see people saying, "Oh, this bread was inedibly salty. I can't believe anybody likes this." Don't listen to those comments. Those people had a failed recipe. They overhydrated, overproofed, or underproofed, and that means they did not get a good rise. The crumb in the bread was extremely dense, and thus the salt particles were closer on their tongue for a perceived oversaltiness. This bread is not too salty for pretty much any normal palate. I fed this bread to diners at my restaurant for 7 years to absolutely rave reviews. But if you are on a sodium-restricted diet, you can certainly lower that content to ½ an ounce or even less, up to and including no salt at all. No salt in the recipe can give you a very robust rise, because while salt does strengthen that gluten network, it also curtails fermentation activity of the yeast and the bacteria that are inside our dough. So salt is a little bit of a double-edged sword, and I have found that 7/10 of an ounce of salt provides plenty of strength to our gluten network while providing an intentional curtailment of the fermentation activity. It slows it down, extends it over a longer period, and the longer fermentation happens, the more flavor we get. So decrease the salt at your own risk. Your bread will rise faster and it will have less flavor, and you need to be a little bit more careful about your rise times to make sure that you don't overproof. All right, let's get this stirred together. When it gets too stiff for the spoon, we ditch the spoon for our hand. Now, if you've done some of those high hydration sourdough recipes and you're accustomed to this dough being extremely sticky and difficult to work with, this is not a high hydration recipe. So your hand shouldn't get absolutely coated with dough, but it is going to leave a little bit of a sticky residue. And you'll notice here, even though that starter was a lot more liquidy, this dough has a very similar texture to the dough we mixed up in the first part of this video with a more recently fed starter. So our hydration definitely isn't off. If you are discovering that this dough is so sticky that it's just completely sticking to your hand, that means you either mismeasured your ingredients or your starter is overhydrated and has more water in it than flour. And if that's the case, watch Troubleshooting Simple Sourdough to learn how to fix your starter. Now, you want to oil or spray your rising vessel so that after the bread has fermented, it's easy to take the dough out of the bowl. However, I'm going to show you another trick that's valuable for those of you who are new to sourdough baking and might have a hard time telling when your bread has actually doubled. And that trick is rising in a Ziploc bag. The Ziploc bag traps the carbon dioxide that's produced during the fermentation process and inflates the bag like a balloon. And this gives you a very good visual clue of how long it is taking your starter to rise your dough. It is certainly not required to use a plastic bag, but it is a very, very valuable technique. And for those of you that hate plastic, I completely understand that. You don't have to do it. But this is a great tool for beginners. We're going to take our bread, drop it into the Ziploc bag, press out the air, and seal the bag. Now, your bread is going to ferment at room temperature. And I know room temperature is a very ambiguous term. It's radically different from household to household, from season to season, and from geographic location to geographic location, right? Throughout the year, my kitchen's room temperature tends to vacillate between 72 and 78 degrees Fahrenheit. That's like 22 to 25 degrees Celsius. And this is the ideal temperature for bread to ferment. In the wintertime, your kitchen might be down into the low 60s, and that just means that it's going to take your bread longer to ferment. But don't worry about that. The longer the fermentation time, the more flavor will be produced in our dough. Conversely, if you live in a warm climate and your kitchen isn't air conditioned, your kitchen might be mid-80s or even up into the 90s at some parts of the year. In this case, fermentation is going to take place much more quickly, and you risk overproofing your dough in these types of circumstances. So in this case, you want to find the coolest place in your house. If you've got a root cellar, put it out there. Otherwise, put it in a dark cabinet close to the floor where temperatures remain the coolest. Now, here's the crux. There's no recipe on planet Earth that can tell you how long to ferment your bread. That is a factor of your individual starter and its characteristics, as well as the rising environment in your kitchen. So I can't tell you this bread will be ready to shape in 12 hours or 16 hours, or that after you shape it, you only need 90 minutes before it goes into the oven. You must must observe your bread the first time you make it so that you understand how long it takes your starter to double your loaf. So when you do this recipe for the first time, please do it on a day off so that you can check in with your dough to see how quickly it's fermenting. For most people, it's going to take between 12 and 24 hours to double. If, however, you have a starter that you feed regularly and it's robust, your fermentation times are going to be significantly less than mine. Also, if it's 85 degrees Fahrenheit in your kitchen, you are going to have shorter fermentation times as well. You must wait until your dough has at least doubled before proceeding to the next step. And the amount of time it takes your dough to at least double will determine how long you rise the dough on the second step before you put it into the oven. So take note of the time it takes your bread to at least double. Now this recipe is super flexible, so you can let your dough rise for hours beyond the point where it at least doubled. In the first example, our dough almost tripled. It had doubled within 12 hours. And I waited 6 additional hours to shape it. That extra salt content in the recipe, which strengthens our gluten network, helps give us a little bit of flexibility with our rise times. And to be honest, it's almost impossible to overproof your dough on the first fermentation. However, if it only takes your dough 6 hours to double, it's going to be super easy to overproof on the second rise. So we need to know how long it takes our dough to double, and we must wait until it at least doubles before proceeding to the next step. A lot of folks ask me if it's possible to do a cold retard, which means putting the dough in the refrigerator to slow down and extend the fermentation time. This can be useful not only for flavor building, but also for scheduling purposes. If you're having a dinner party on Saturday, but you've got a really busy Friday, and that's normally the day that you would start this loaf, you can actually start this loaf on Wednesday or Thursday and give it more time in the refrigerator. That slows down the process, but exponentially boosts the flavor. If you're going to do that, I really recommend you give your dough at least 6 hours of room temperature time out on the countertop before you put it in the fridge. This allows the metabolic process of the yeast and the bacteria to really start going before you slow it down. Once it's in the fridge, it can stay there for as short or really as long as you want, up to about 3 days. But we must make sure that the dough has at least doubled in volume before we proceed to the next step, and putting the dough in the refrigerator slows that process down. You should also plan to pull your dough from the refrigerator and let it come to room temperature at least 2 hours before you shape it. Now, I often find myself needing to bake bread at a location other than where I started it. Dinner party at a friend's house, family reunion, camping, and in those cases, I like to rise my dough in a Ziploc bag. Again, give it about 6 hours of countertop time before you throw it in the fridge. Then you can move it from the fridge to an ice chest if you're on a road trip somewhere, as long as it stays relatively cool and keeps that fermentation process on the slow side. Then you just got to make sure you pull it for a couple of hours to warm to room temperature before you shape, second rise, and bake. So I'm going to let the time-lapse camera take over, and I'll see you tomorrow. Right now, our dough is undergoing what is known as the bulk fermentation, and this is a term from professional bakeries where the dough for multiple loaves is undergoing its first fermentation in bulk, or all together. After the bulk fermentation, the dough is separated into individual portions for baking loaves, and then it undergoes subsequent rises before baking. Now, we use these terms ferment and rise interchangeably, but rising is the physical result of a chemical reaction called fermentation. And it's very important for you to understand in basic terms what fermentation is, because it will help you understand when things go wrong. And yes, this does involve just a little bit of science.
Oh, science!
Science! It's science.
Science!
Science.
Science!
Science?
It's science!
Science!
And I understand that you may have hated science class in school, but your science teacher did not have naughty animation like I do. Inside our sourdough starter, and thus also inside our dough, you have a very diverse range of wild yeasts that originated on the grains themselves of wheat as they were growing in the field, stayed on those grains through processing into flour, and made their way into your starter. The first family of beneficial organisms we have in our starter are yeasts. Now, when you bake with this stuff, you are using one selected and improved strain of yeast, but in your starter, you have a host of wild yeasts. And yeasts are after one thing: sugar. And there is a ton of sugar in our dough because the instant we add water to flour, the starches in that flour begin to break down into simple sugars, and that's exactly what our yeast are after. The instant that they spot that sugar, they go in for the kill, and they absolutely gorge themselves on that sugar. But what happens when we gorge ourselves on food? You got it. We fart. In this case, yeast fart carbon dioxide gas, and if our gluten network in the dough is strong enough, that carbon dioxide gets trapped inside the gluten network. And as more gas is produced, the dough rises. Then when we put that dough in the oven, those individual bubbles of carbon dioxide gas start to expand just like a hot air balloon, and that is what causes our bread to rise. And there is one more important metabolic process that happens when yeast eat sugar. They pee, just like we do, only their pee is ethyl alcohol, commonly known as booze. And the family of yeasts that we use to ferment bread are the exact same family of yeasts that vintners, brewers, and distillers use to produce alcohol. Now, when you bake with this stuff, the ethyl alcohol produced by the yeast just disseminates into the dough, and then when we bake it, it evaporates off, starting at around 172 degrees Fahrenheit, and there's really no residual alcohol left in our bread by the time we eat it. But something very different is happening to that ethyl alcohol in the sourdough fermentation process, because we have a second family of beneficial organisms living inside our starter. Billions of bacteria, lactobacillus and acetobacillus bacteria, also exist in harmony with the yeast inside of our starter. And not only do those little bacteria also love eating simple sugars just like the yeast do, they also love to devour ethyl alcohol. That's right, they are booze hounds. And they throw a big old kegger inside our dough as it's fermenting. But just like when we drink too much beer, the seal gets broken and you gotta pee. In this case though, our bacteria are peeing out acid, lactic acid, and acetic acid, also known as vinegar, are their byproduct of consuming the alcohol produced by the yeast. And the resulting acids produce that distinct tang that we know of as sourdough flavor. Now, my method does not produce a very sour dough. So if you're one of those people that really doesn't like a super tangy sourdough, this method is absolutely for you. If you're one of those folks that really loves an extremely tart sourdough, well, guess what? You're actually misled. Most of that sour flavor is fake. Virtually all commercial bread manufacturers augment their sourdough with additional acids to make them taste the way you expect them to taste. If you'd like a fascinating eye-opener, check out my video here, Why is my sourdough not sour? Because chances are your expectation of a very tart loaf is from a manufacturer that's just adding acid to their dough. But all sourdoughs have an increased level of natural acidity in them, and this extra acidity helps the bread be a little bit more tender than doughs that are made with commercial yeast. And unlike ethyl alcohol, which evaporates off during the baking process, the acetic and lactic acids stay in the bread during the baking process. And that extra acidity helps prevent the breads from molding. So all sourdough breads naturally have a longer shelf life time because they are more resistant to invasion by mold. Pretty cool, huh? It has been 24 hours and we can see there's definitely activity happening in our dough, but I'm not quite ready to shape this dough yet. You can see where the plastic bag is actually making contact with the dough that we do have a very fine bubble structure existing within this dough. However, we've had very little carbon dioxide production during that first 24-hour period. We've only got a minor bit of inflation in this bag. And what we really want to see in terms of carbon dioxide production is an inflation to the bag, almost like a balloon. Now, granted, our starter had not been fed in 5 months, and it was a relatively new, fairly weak starter to begin with. But I'm doing this to intentionally prove to you guys that you do not have to feed your starter on a regular basis to make a perfect loaf of bread. The rule of thumb is that we must wait until the loaf has at least doubled. And although this dough has spread out quite a bit, I don't feel like it's quite ready for shaping, so I'm gonna give it another 8 to 12 hours and see what happens then. So I gave my dough 12 more hours to ferment and now it is perfect. Let's take a look. The bag is completely inflated with carbon dioxide, just like a balloon. You'll see lots of big, beautiful air bubbles. So this dough is ready to shape and bake. All right, let's talk about baking vessels. My favorite way to bake this loaf is in a cast iron Dutch oven. I like the fact that cast iron holds heat well, it moderates heat well, resulting in less potential burning and a more even bake. But you do not have to have a cast iron Dutch oven. I'm certainly going to show you how you can bake this in a standard 9-inch loaf pan. Cast iron loaf pans are also fine, and it's even better if you have got two identically sized loaf pans, because you can make a little cloche just like this. For those of you that have a Pullman loaf pan, this recipe also works quite well. A Pullman loaf pan has a little lid that goes on top, and as the bread rises in the oven, it compresses the bread into a perfect square or rectangle. That makes for cool looking and very evenly shaped toast and sandwiches. Of course, this is a lean dough recipe, and it's not really the best for sandwiches. I have a wonderful sourdough sandwich loaf recipe linked right up here if you're looking to make the perfect bread for sandwiches. But I know many of you will want to bake this in a loaf pan, and that's perfectly fine. I also get a lot of questions about clay bakers or cloches, and if you have one of those, you can absolutely use it with no modifications to the recipe. Of course, there are a lot of different styles of those. Sometimes they look a little bit more like a Dutch oven, and sometimes they look a little bit more like a loaf pan. So you'll follow whichever method is most appropriate to the shape of your clay baker. In terms of Dutch ovens, my favorite size is this 4-quart Dutch oven. It's about 9 inches in diameter and about 4.5 inches deep, and that's the ideal size for baking this loaf of bread. You don't end up with a lot of wasted space inside the Dutch oven. Amazon has actually sold out of these multiple times over just because of my videos. But I tried to keep a link in the video description below of the exact model that I like to use, or one that's equivalently sized. But if you want a Dutch oven that'll do double duty in your kitchen, you can bake bread in it, but you can also use it for braising meats or like all-day cooked stews, you might spring for one that's slightly larger. It does not matter whether the Dutch oven is enameled or raw cast iron. Just understand that when baking at high temperatures, like 425 degrees for this recipe, is eventually going to weaken the enamel on your Dutch oven, and it will start to flake off. That's why I don't recommend using a really expensive, nice Dutch oven to bake this bread. Get yourself one for 30 or 40 bucks on Amazon that you can devote to the use and abuse that it will get baking your sourdough bread. There are also smaller, cheaper 2-quart Dutch ovens, and this recipe will fit inside of one of these, but the bread ends up coming out looking sort of like a panettone, that Italian holiday bread with the straight sides and then the dome top. And if your bread gets a really good rise, you might actually lift the lid off of this container and it'll be deformed a little bit where it pressed on the lid. So this 2 to 3-quart size isn't ideal, but it will work. Regardless of what type of baking vessel you're using, you need to prepare it accordingly so that the dough does not stick to the baking vessel. And since we're starting in a cold oven, that is a higher risk than if we had preheated our Dutch oven. Make sure you liberally spray or rub oil all along the sides of the Dutch oven and the bottom that are going to come in contact with the dough. You can also use parchment. But if you've ever had a loaf stick to the inside of the Dutch oven, the frustration of that can absolutely make you want to turn to the expense of parchment. Now, I prefer these pre-cut parchment sheets, which I'll link in the video description below. Not only are they super convenient for a regular sized sheet tray, but when you buy them in bulk sheets like this, they're actually cheaper than the roll. And there's no human in history that can tear a piece of parchment perfectly off the roll. It always rips unevenly, right? I hate having to get out scissors too. If you're going to use parchment, some of my wonderful viewers have shared the tip that you crumple it up first. Stretch it back out, and then crumple it up again. Now, it has the flexibility to easily conform to the bottom of the pan. That way, those creases of parchment don't bake into the bread as it expands in the Dutch oven, and then you gotta cut out chunks of parchment that are baked into the bottom of your loaf. As for me, I don't waste money with parchment. I rarely have an issue of bread dough sticking. When it does stick, it means I've screwed up my hydration and somehow gotten too much liquid into the dough. And if that's the case, you got more problems than just the bread sticking to the pan. As I've mentioned, as long as your starter is sleepy and doesn't get fed on a regular basis, there is a great amount of flexibility on this first rise. You can wait 2, 4, 6, 8, 10 hours after the bread doubles before you need to shape it and bake it without it overproofing. That's not the case if you feed your starter regularly. If you have a robust starter and you see this bag looking like this after 4 to 6 hours, you need to shape, rise, and bake your dough pretty quickly after that point. And my little phrase, the longer it sits, the more flavor you get, that is true if you have a sleepy starter. If you have a robust starter and you try to leave this at room temperature fermenting for a really long time to try to get more flavor out of it, you're going to build significant acidity, and the acidity actually destroys the gluten structure of the dough, rendering it incapable of holding the carbon dioxide in that allows it to rise. So if you have a very robust starter and you want to use this method, you really need to consider slowing the fermentation down by refrigerating your dough several hours after it's formed. Keep in mind that your yeast are continually producing carbon dioxide, so as this bag inflates, the pressure will get higher and higher, and if you wait too long, guess what's going to happen? Poof! The bag is going to explode and your dough is going to spill out all over wherever it's sitting. So do not let your pressure get too high. This amount of pressure is actually pretty high, but because my starter hadn't been fed in more than 5 months, I really wanted to make sure we had a good, robust fermentation going to make sure we've got decent rise. I'm going to bake today in a conventionally sized 6-quart Dutch oven. I used my smaller 4-quart, which is the ideal size for this recipe, in the original demonstration, but to show you that it's perfectly fine to use a full-size Dutch oven, we're going to use that today. I just use oil. I don't feel the need to use parchment. We're going to start the shaping process by lightly flouring the surface. Not too much flour. We actually want the surface to be a little bit sticky because that's what helps us form a tight boule. Now, if you have risen in a Ziploc bag, I recommend you turn the bag over and let the dough sort of detach from the top surface. Then you can open your bag and dump the bread out onto your work surface. You want to make sure that there is plenty of flour on your hands. The first step in this process is called pre-shaping. I don't really do much pre-shaping. I basically just try to come in here and tuck the edges of the dough under itself to roughly form a little ball like that. Then I reflour my hands and start the actual tightening process. Now this is extremely difficult to describe, but once you actually get the dough in your hands, it becomes a little bit more intuitive. So if you don't understand exactly how to do this based on my instruction, you're going to get the hang of it once you've actually got dough in your hand. You're basically going to be running the bottom edge of your hand along the countertop, dragging the dough towards you, and that actually produces a tightening effect across the top of it. Then you're going to rotate the dough a little bit and then bring it towards you again. So I'll use one hand to rotate, then both hands to pull. One hand to rotate, both hands to pull. Like this. Rotate and pull. Rotate and pull. Rotate and pull over and over again, and then you're going to get a nice tight skin on the top of that dough. It should take you less than 10 turns to get this dough really nice and tight, and anytime it starts to get sticky, get more flour on your hands. Once you've got that into a nice tight boule, you want to kind of use your hands on the bottom side of it to squeeze that dough together into a nice tight structure, and then it goes into your baking vessel. Now, if your dough is just absolutely too sticky to work with, that means you're overhydrated. You have too much water in your dough. And if you're confident you measured your ingredients correctly, that extra water is coming from your starter. You need to correct your starter's hydration with a couple of big successive feedings, and I teach you how to do that in my troubleshooting simple sourdough video. But you can save this loaf by kneading a little bit of extra flour into it at this point until it becomes workable. If you find as you're trying to get a tight boule that the dough is just sort of tearing open, this means that your dough is over-acidified. The gluten structure of the dough has been destroyed by high acidity. This can happen through very warm fermentations or fermentations that went for too long. It can also happen if the bacterial profile of your starter is just very prolific on the acid-producing end. We solve this through slowing the fermentation down, using the refrigerator for the majority of the rise time. Now, we're going to cover our loaf for its second rise, which takes place at room temperature. The majority of you are going to want about 90 minutes for the rise. Do not expect the bread to double during that time, because remember, we're baking our loaf in a cold oven. So as the oven preheats, the bread will finish rising on its way to baking. So we're only looking for about a 50% increase in the volume of the dough before you're ready to score and bake. That's going to be 90 minutes or less for the overwhelming majority of you. But since this starter hadn't been fed in 5 months, I'm going to err on the side of a little bit longer. I'm probably going to let it go 100 or 110 minutes before we score and bake. If you've got a very robust starter that doubles your dough in less than 8 hours, your second rise really only needs to be 45 minutes before you put it in the oven. And if it takes somewhere between 8 and 12 hours for you to double, your second rise should probably only be an hour. But for the majority of you with sleepy starters, 90 minutes is just about the sweet spot. Of course, if you don't have a Dutch oven, you can easily bake this recipe in a loaf pan. A standard 9-inch loaf pan is perfect for this recipe. It's even better if you have two identically sized 9-inch loaf pans, because then one loaf pan can sit on top of the other, which acts similarly to the lid on our Dutch oven. It increases the humidity of our baking environment inside the baking vessel, which allows the bread to rise higher before it skins over. It also results in a better crust. But if you don't have two loaf pans, that's completely fine. This recipe also works great in a Pullman loaf pan. This is an 8x4 Pullman loaf pan, and it works pretty well for this amount of dough. One thing to keep in mind with the Pullman loaf pans is that they have little steam holes on the bottom, allowing the steam to escape so that the dough can perfectly inflate to the entire inside of the pan. So you want to make sure that you're rising and baking your Pullman loaves on a small baking tray like this. Just as with the Dutch oven, you want to spray or line with parchment to make sure the dough does not stick to the inside of your baking vessel. So we've got our dough here that's been fermenting for about 20 hours and is ready for shaping. I have recently migrated to the King Arthur method for loaf shaping. It's different from what I grew up with, but it's slightly more complex, and I enjoy that extra challenge during loaf shaping, and it really does make a beautifully formed loaf. You can also search YouTube for different ways of forming a loaf, but I'm gonna teach you the King Arthur method, and they also actually have a really wonderful video that goes into the method in detail if you're new to this and it seems a little bit confusing to you. Now, unlike with boule shaping, we want a fairly generous amount of flour on our shaping surface. Now we're going to remove that dough. We're going to add a little bit of flour to the surface of the dough. And now we basically want to shape the dough into a rectangle that is just a little bit narrower than our loaf pan. So we're going to do that by stretching and patting. Patting helps ensure that the bread is of even thickness all the way across the rectangle. You don't want to end up with a loaf of bread that's bigger at one end than the other, right? So it's important that you've got a fairly even thickness across this loaf. Also, when we're baking in a loaf pan, sort of the goal is toast or sandwiches. And in that case, we definitely don't want any big holes, because that's where our mayonnaise or mustard or our jam is going to spill through, right? So degassing the loaf like this or pressing out the air bubbles, make sure we have a fairly even inner crumb. All right, looks pretty good, pretty even. First step is to take the top of that rectangle and fold it down 2/3 to 3/4 of the way down the loaf. About right there. Now we're going to give it a nice pat to make sure there's no air bubbles trapped in there and the two sides are nicely fused together. Now we're going to do the paper airplane move. So we're going to take each corner and fold it down to create a triangle point. Just like that. Now we're going to begin the rolling process. So we take that point and bring it down towards us, push it down to get a good seal, and then push back towards the opposite side of the countertop. That pushing backwards creates surface tension along the top side of the loaf. Make sure your hands are well floured so they don't stick to the dough. And we're going to do another roll and push. And another roll and push. And another roll and push until we get down to that folded seam here. Next, we're going to take these two little ends here and bring them in, giving a nice pat to seal. And then we continue the rolling and pushing. I like to use the sides of my fingers like this to push back evenly, just to make sure we're creating lots of good tension there. And then once you get down to where there's only a little bit of a flap left, we're going to roll the dough back onto a nicely floured section of the board. And we're going to pull tight and seal, just to make sure that that seam does not come undone as the bread rises in the oven. Now, because our dough was fairly slack, you'll notice that we are longer than our actual baking pan. That's not a problem. We can kind of squoosh it together as we roll it over to put into the bread pan. All right, and we're going to transfer it here. I like to pat it just to make sure it's well seated, and you really need to make sure that that seam is on the very bottom of the loaf pan. That is a natural weak point where the bread will want to open up, so we need the weight of the loaf sitting right on top of it to make sure that it does not open and split up. Otherwise, that bread will kind of rise this way and unravel itself in the pan. Now, we want to cover either with the other loaf pan, a damp kitchen towel, plastic wrap, something like that. and this loaf is going to proof for 90 minutes. However, these same proofing rules apply if you are using a very robust starter that gets fed frequently and your initial dough doubled in 8 hours or less. You only need a 45-minute rise time. If your bulk ferment doubled in 8 to 12 hours, 60 minutes is a good second rise time. But for the rest of you, 90 minutes is just perfect. 90 minutes later, we've got about a 50% rise or so, and it is time to score. Easiest way, again, with scissors. You can score 3 diagonal gashes across the top, or you can go straight down the center in a line. Or my preferred way to do it is with a razor blade, right down the center, 1/2 inch to 1 inch deep, and make a quick, precise cut so that your dough does not stick to the razor blade and it drags through slowly, which deforms the dough. When we scored the loaf, we held the razor blade at a 90-degree angle to the countertop, straight up and down. But when we're scoring a boule, we want to change that angle more towards a 30 to 45-degree angle. We actually don't want to cut in the center. We want to move about 2/3 of the way across the loaf and cut it this direction. Again, you want to work definitively and precisely and firmly, but it can be a little bit tricky working in the confines of the bowl. Still, it's going to work. When we keep our bread so tightly enclosed as it bakes, that baking environment closely mimics the steam-injected ovens that professional bakers use. It's important to have a really humid baking environment because as that bread is rising, once it gets to a certain temperature, the outside layer of that crust is going to harden. And as soon as it hardens, the bread isn't going to rise anymore. We obviously want to maximize the potential of our rise. So the longer that outer skin of the bread stays moist, the higher the bread can rise before the crust sets. So if you're baking in a loaf pan and don't have a second loaf pan to sit on top as a cloche during the first portion of baking, your bread's crust is going to set at a smaller size and your crumb will be correspondingly tighter. But honestly, it's not really a big deal. Still, the more humid we can keep our baking environment, the better our bread will be. If you happen to be baking this bread at elevation, the nice thing about that is that the closed baking environment stays humid for longer. At elevation, water evaporates at a lower temperature, so you get more evaporation outside of the loaf. However, because we've got our handy lid on top, it is keeping the baking environment moist. I have baked this bread at elevations close to 9,000 feet without any modification to the recipe at all. If you don't have the top loaf pan on, this can just go in absolutely naked. I'm going to say this again. Listen to me very carefully. You turn the oven on to 425 degrees Fahrenheit and then you start the timer. The timer does not begin from the time the oven reaches temperature. Just for your own information, my oven takes about 20 minutes to heat up to 425 degrees. But if yours takes more or less, it's no problem. You are going to learn the perfect baking times for your oven the more you bake this loaf. Also, if your oven has a convection setting, convection isn't really beneficial to us here because for the majority of the baking time, the bread is enclosed and protected from the air that is circulating throughout the convection oven. And after 45 minutes, the lids come off. 15 more minutes. And 15 minutes later, they're done. All right, we are going to get this out onto a cooling rack. Y'all, this is a perfect loaf of sourdough bread from a starter that had not been fed in 5 months. And I know from previous experience that this bread is going to have a lot more flavor because the starving starters that ferment for a much longer time produce really intense, complex flavor in their loaves. Now, it is taking all of my willpower not to tear into this loaf right now. It's so beautiful and smells so incredible. But you must remember not to slice into bread that is fresh out of the oven. And that is because the crumb is still very damp and moist, and if I slice into this with a bread knife, that crumb is gonna gum up on the knife, and then the knife is just gonna chew through that loaf and destroy the crumb. You must wait at least 30 minutes before you cut into this loaf. If you can't wait 30 minutes before tearing into it, then you need to literally tear into it. Tear it apart with your hands. Tearing the loaf and then dipping it in olive oil or whatever will actually work just fine, as long as you don't burn your fingers. But to get a proper slice, the cooler the bread is, the better. At the restaurant, we would fully cool the loaves for a couple of hours, slice them into individual portions, and then rewarm the bread just before passing it at the table. That is the smartest thing to do. Folks, There are a lot of sourdough instructors out there and even professional bakers that insist that the only way you can make a loaf of sourdough bread is with a hyperactive, freshly fed starter. Well, what the heck is this? Folks, those people are thinking like this. Lots of yeast leavening power to get a high rise, but then they also know that sourdough is supposed to be more flavorful, and we get more flavor from long, slow fermentations. So after they make you feed your starter regularly, which involves wasteful discard, then they make you put your dough into the refrigerator to slow that process down. Well, why didn't they just start with sleepy, sluggish starter to begin with? Because it clearly makes a gorgeous loaf of bread. Folks, this complexity and frustration that you're finding is all in the quest of big holes from high hydration, and we've been over this. I personally think that it is misled to promote the aesthetics of a loaf of bread over the flavor and the ease of its production. Yes, there is a time and a place for high hydration sourdough, English muffins, focaccia, Spanish glass bread. But for your everyday bread that should be easy to produce, look beautiful, and taste delicious, Let's take a closer look and listen to this loaf just before we slice it. That's got a wonderful crackle to it. The amount of browning on a loaf is really sort of a personal preference. Your loaf doesn't have to be this brown, but for some people looking at this loaf, they might think it's not quite brown enough. If your loaf comes out of the oven fairly pale after this full hour of cooking, it could be that your oven bakes cool. And if that's the case, you can just bump your baking temperature up 450 degrees. Conversely, if it's a little bit too dark for you, lower your temperature 10 or 15 degrees for the next bake. If your bread is burnt on the bottom, your oven bakes hot. You may need to put a baking tray or two underneath the Dutch oven before it goes into the oven, and that will provide a little bit more thermal mass and even out the heating on the bottom. You can also try lowering your oven's baking temperature by 10 or 15 degrees on your next bake. All right, let's slice this baby open and see how she tastes. Beautiful crumb. Very nice, light, moist. And it smells incredible. And now for the taste. That is good bread, you guys. Compared to that first loaf that we baked, the flavor of this is deep and rich and complex and intense. The crumb is tender and moist, but the crust is light and flaky and crispy. I think you would be hard-pressed to bake a loaf of bread that tastes any better than this, and we only spent 10 minutes on it. Before we wrap up, I want to address a few questions that I get really frequently that will help you deal with the aftermath of the bread once it is out of the oven and cooled. For slicing, the very best option you have is an offset serrated bread knife. Now, if you are a knife snob, a bread knife is not the thing that you want to spend money on. Serrated knives can never be sharpened again to the same perfection that they are when they arrive from the factory. So never spend more than about $30 on a bread knife, and you can get them for cheaper than that, and that knife will last you for several years of regular slicing before it's time to buy a new one. My favorite bread knife is linked in the video description below if you want to get the one that I use. I use it all the time, and it lasts a long time before it needs to be replaced. The offset shape is particularly important because the blade sits lower than your hand. This allows you to cut all the way down to the surface of the cutting board without mashing your fingers on the cutting board itself. So whatever knife you get, make sure that it is an offset. These also work great for thinly slicing tomatoes. Now, when slicing your bread, it is never as easy to slice as it is after it has fully cooled on bake day. So in the event you have bread left over at the end of the day, I recommend you go ahead and slice the entire loaf. That also makes it super and quick to grab a slice in the coming days after you've baked the bread. You don't have to get out your knife again. The best way I have found to preserve the freshness of bread over several days after bake day is using beeswax infused cloth. I linked to this in the video description, but I have discovered that this keeps the bread nice and moist without it becoming sweaty, which happens when you wrap it in plastic wrap or store it in a Ziploc bag, and the bread stays fresh for several days after baking. The cool thing about this beeswax cloth is that it sort of sticks to itself, but it doesn't stick to the bread. So you can actually form your own custom bag that completely wraps the bread, meaning it's not going to lose very much moisture at all to evaporation. But if there's residual warmth inside the bread, it's not going to create condensation and like steam the bread into a sogginess the way it would in a plastic bag. These beeswax cloths aren't super cheap, but they'll last you for a year or even longer if you take care of them. After you use them once, just wipe them off, and if they need a little bit of cleaning, you can clean them with cool soapy water. The one thing that you must never, ever, ever, ever do is put bread in the refrigerator. The refrigerator ruins bread. The refrigerator stales bread exponentially faster than it does at room temperature. This is because starch, which makes up the majority of flour, is actually crystalline in form if you look at it under the microscope. Now, after we hydrate that starch with water and bake it in the oven, those crystals tend to sort of explode and trap that water. But they're desperate to return to their original crystalline shape. And so as the bread sits, those starch crystals move back toward each other and restructure themselves in crystalline form. And as they do it, they push out moisture. Guess what does this way, way faster than room temperature storage? The refrigerator. Guess what slows that way, way down, even more so than keeping it at room temperature? The freezer. So if you want to serve your bread again in 2 or 3 days, wrap it and put it in the freezer. Otherwise, the second best spot for it is on the countertop, and it should never, ever, 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 ever go into the refrigerator. If you've kept it on the countertop wrapped in this beeswax plastic, it'll be good if you taste it on day 1 or day 2. But the secret trick to making bread taste fresh several days after it's baked is to rewarm it. Rewarming it rehydrates those crystals. They absorb the moisture again from the moisture around them and the moisture in the air, and bread tastes almost as fresh as the day it was baked. So, rewarm or toast your bread to bring life back into it, whether it's been sitting on the countertop or in the freezer, but never in the fridge. Again, folks, the printable recipe for this video is on my website, ultimatefoodgeek.com. You can expand the video description and link right over to it. And there's also everything you could possibly want detailed in that video description, from the full recipe to all of the toys I've used in this video. If you have found this video helpful, interesting, or even mildly entertaining, please give me a like and a subscribe. You have no idea how much those subscriptions help me out. If you have questions, feedback, or need a little bit of help with this method, please comment below. I read every single comment submitted to my channel, and I try to respond to anybody that needs help or input. Folks, it's been a wild 4 years, and I've got so much more to share with you in the kitchen. Not only everything related to sourdough, but beyond just flour and water, as well as beyond the boundaries of my kitchen. We have a lot of adventures to share together. So make sure you subscribe, and I look forward to seeing you on the next video. I am Ben Starr, the Ultimate Food Geek. Thanks for watching and have a great day.